Picture a horizon darkened by a storm, not of rain or thunder, but of dust kicked up by millions of hooves. This is the enduring image of the 13th century, a nightmare that haunted the sleep of kings from Beijing to Budapest. The popular narrative tells us that when the Mongols descended upon the civilized world, they did so as an irresistible force of nature, a human tsunami that simply overwhelmed their enemies through sheer, crushing weight of numbers. We are told of the Golden Horde, of an endless sea of warriors that drank rivers dry and stripped the land bare like locusts. Historical chroniclers, trembling in their monasteries and citadels, wrote of armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands, sometimes even reaching the millions. To them it seemed the entire population of hell had been emptied onto the steppe to scourge the earth. But history is often written by the terrified as much as by the victors. When we strip away the hyperbole of frightened scribes and apply the cold logic of military science, geography, and logistics, a very different picture emerges. It is a picture that changes our understanding of one of the greatest empires the world has ever seen. The reality is that the Mongol army was never that big. In fact, in almost every major engagement that built their empire, they were significantly outnumbered. The myth of the endless horde is just that, a myth. And the truth behind their numbers reveals something far more terrifying than a mindless swarm. It reveals a level of military efficiency, tactical genius, and operational discipline that the world had never seen before, and has rarely seen since. To understand the Mongol conquest, we must stop counting heads and start looking at the grass, the horses, and the mind of Genghis Khan. To understand why the numbers reported by medieval historians are impossible, we have to look first at the engine of the Mongol war machine, the horse. The Mongol warrior was nothing without his mount. But unlike the European knight who rode a single large destrier into battle, or the Arab cavalryman with his prized mare, the Mongol trooper did not rely on just one animal. The Mongol style of warfare was predicated on continuous high-speed mobility. A single horse, carrying a fully equipped warrior across the rough terrain of the Eurasian steppe, would tire and collapse within days if pushed to the Mongol standard of operations. Therefore, each warrior maintained a string of remounts. The estimates vary, but the consensus is that a single soldier would have between 3 and 5 horses with him on campaign. Some sources suggest as many as 8 or 10 for the elite heavy cavalry. This seemingly minor detail is the mathematical key that unlocks the truth about the army's size. If you have an army of 100,000 men, you do not merely have 100,000 mouths to feed. You have, at a conservative estimate, 400,000 horses. Now, we must consider the ecology of the steppe and the terrain of the lands they invaded. These horses were not stall-fed grain-eaters. They were hardy steppe ponies that grazed on pasture. They required vast tracts of land to graze every single day. A string of 500,000 horses is a logistical leviathan. It requires an immense amount of acreage to sustain. If an army of that size stops for more than a day or two in one location, the grass is gone. The water sources are fouled or drained. The herd must keep moving, not just for conquest, but for survival. This ecological reality places a hard ceiling on the size of any nomadic army. The limitless horde described by European monks would have starved its own animals within a week. The carrying capacity of the land, particularly when invading the agricultural societies of China, the Middle East, or Europe, simply could not support the millions of men described in ancient texts. When the Mongols invaded Hungary, for example, the Hungarian plain, the Pannonian Basin, was the only area in Europe that geographically resembled the steppe. Yet modern calculations regarding the caloric needs of horses and the biomass of the grass available in the 13th century suggest that this region could support a maximum of perhaps 50 to 60,000 Mongol warriors with their requisite horse strings. Any more than that, and the army destroys its own means of mobility. So, if they weren't drowning their enemies in bodies, how did they generate such fear? How did they convince the world they were legion? The answer lies in a combination of psychological warfare, superior operational tempo, and a deception so profound it is still fooling people 800 years later. The Mongols were masters of the feigned ubiquity. They understood that the most powerful weapon in war is the mind of the enemy commander. If you can make your opponent believe he is facing 1,000,000 men, he will make mistakes. He will retreat, he will cower behind walls, or he will surrender before the first arrow is loosed. The Mongols actively cultivated the myth of their own numbers. During campaigns, each warrior was often instructed to light multiple campfires at night. A scout watching from a distant ridge would see the valley floor ablaze with firelight, calculating 10 men for every fire, and report back that the stars themselves had fallen to earth. Furthermore, they used dummies mounted on spare horses. As the battle lines formed, the Mongols would place straw men on their remounts and have them stand in the rear ranks or on the flanks. To a terrified infantryman peering through the dust, the Mongol line seemed to stretch to infinity. The dust itself was a weapon. They would tie bundles of brush to the tails of their horses, kicking up massive clouds that obscured their true numbers and made small raiding parties look like massive invading columns. But the greatest multiplier of their force was speed. The strategic mobility of the Mongol army is unrivaled in the pre-industrial age. An army that moves twice as fast as its enemy effectively has twice the number of troops. They could strike a city in the north, vanish, and reappear 300 miles away to sack a city in the south before the news of the first attack had even arrived. This operational tempo created a sense of omnipresence. Enemy generals felt they were being attacked from all sides simultaneously. When the Mongols invaded the Khwarezmian Empire, a massive superpower of the Islamic world, they did not attack as a single blob. They split into 4 distinct columns, attacking from different directions, traversing deserts thought to be impassable. The Shah of Khwarezm, with an army that vastly outnumbered the Mongols, was paralyzed. He kept his forces scattered to defend his cities, terrified by reports of Mongol armies appearing everywhere at once. He was defeated in detail, his massive army sliced apart piece by piece, never able to bring its full weight to bear against the concentrated mobile strike forces of the invaders. This brings us to the actual structure of the army. It was not a horde. Horde implies a disorganized rabble, a chaotic mass. The Mongol army was the exact opposite. It was organized on a strict decimal system that was ruthlessly efficient. The base unit was the Arban, a squad of 10 men. 10 Arbans made a Jagun, a company of 100. 10 Jaguns made a Min, Gan, a regiment of 1,000. And 10 Mingans made a Tumen, a division of 10,000. The Tumen was the largest operational unit. It was a self-contained army capable of independent action. When we look at the historical records through the lens of this structure, the numbers clarify. When Genghis Khan united the tribes of Mongolia in 1206, the secret history of the Mongols, the most reliable internal source we have, lists the commanders of the Mingans. By tallying these commanders and the units assigned to them, historians estimate the total fighting force of the newly unified Mongol nation was roughly 95,000 to 105,000 men. Think about that number. 100,000 men. That is the force that set out to conquer the world. It is a large army, certainly, but it is not a million. It is comparable to the armies of Rome at its height, or the armies fielded by the great powers of China. In fact, when the Mongols attacked the Jin dynasty of northern China, they were invading a nation with a population of tens of millions and a standing army that likely numbered close to 500,000 or more. The Mongols were outnumbered 5 to 1, perhaps 10 to 1. If they had relied on human wave tactics, they would have been annihilated in weeks. Instead, they relied on quality. The Mongol warrior was a professional soldier in a world of feudal levies. In Europe, an army was a gathering of farmers handed spears, led by a small elite of knights. In China, armies were massive conscript forces, often poorly motivated and slow to maneuver. The Mongol army was composed entirely of cavalry, and every man had been training for war since the moment he could walk. They could shoot a bird on the wing while galloping at full speed. They could sleep in the saddle. They could endure hunger, thirst, and cold that would kill a sedentary man. His disparity in quality meant that one Mongol was worth 10 of his enemies. But even more important was the discipline instilled by Genghis Khan. In a feudal army, a knight fought for personal glory. He might charge ahead of the line to capture a prize or prove his bravery. In the Mongol army, such an action was punishable by death. Absolute obedience to the signals of the commanders, communicated by flags during the day and lanterns at night, was the law. Silence was enforced in the ranks. European observers were often unsettled by the eerie quiet of a Mongol approach, contrasting it with the shouting and clamor of their own troops. This discipline allowed them to execute the most difficult maneuver in warfare, the feigned retreat. This tactic requires nerves of steel. A unit must engage the enemy, then turn and run, pretending to panic. They must allow the enemy to chase them, often taking casualties in the process, drawing the opposing force out of formation. Then, at a precise signal, they must wheel around, reform, and slaughter the disorganized pursuers. Most armies that attempted this simply kept running. The Mongols executed it with the precision of a ballet. At the Battle of Kalka River, the Mongols led the Russian princes on a chase for days before turning and crushing them. At the Battle of Legnica, they destroyed the flower of Polish knighthood, using the same trick. This was not the work of a mindless swarm, it was the work of a surgical instrument. Let us look closer at the invasion of Europe, specifically the campaign of 1241, to see the reality of these numbers in action. This campaign is often cited as the moment the horde threatened to swallow Christendom. The primary commander was Subutai, perhaps the greatest military strategist who ever lived. He was coordinating an invasion of a continent he had never seen, relying on intelligence gathered by spies over the previous decade. Subutai did not have hundreds of thousands of men. Modern estimates suggest the entire force sent west into Europe numbered perhaps 2 or 3 tumens, 20 to 30,000 men, split into 2 prongs. One prong went north into Poland to distract the northern allies, while the main force struck south into Hungary. At the Battle of Mohi, where the Hungarian kingdom was shattered, Subutai likely had no more than 25,000 troops. The Hungarian king Bela IV had called upon his entire nobility and likely fielded an army of equal or greater size. The Mongols won not because they flooded the plain with bodies, but because Subutai outmaneuvered the Hungarians. He used a night march to flank their position. Crossing a bridge the Hungarians thought was secure and surrounded their camp. He then deliberately left a gap in his lines, a golden bridge, to tempt the Hungarians to flee. As the panicked Europeans streamed out of the gap thinking they had escaped, the fresh Mongol horsemen rode them down one by one. It was a victory of geometry and psychology, not arithmetic. The perception of the limitless army also comes from the Mongol practice of incorporating subject peoples. As the empire expanded, the core Mongol force, the ethnic Mongols from the steppe, actually became a minority in their own armies. They would draft engineers from China to build siege engines. They would use Turkic cavalry from the conquered tribes of Central Asia. They would force local populations to march ahead of them as human shields or to fill moats with bundles of grass. When a city looked out at the besieging force, they saw a sea of people. But the elite corps, the shock troops who actually delivered the victory, remained a small, tight-knit group. This small corps explains why the empire eventually fractured. There were simply never enough Mongols to garrison the world they conquered. They could defeat any army in the field, but they could not occupy every city from the Pacific to the Danube with Mongol bodies. They had to rely on local administrators, terror, and the reputation of their invincibility to keep the empire together. It is also vital to analyze the census data we do have. In the later years of the empire, during the Yuan dynasty in China, we have records of the military households. These records confirm that the actual Mongol population was surprisingly small. The entire Mongol nation, men, women, children, and elders, likely numbered under 2 million people during the time of Genghis Khan. If you apply the standard demographic model where able-bodied military-age males make up perhaps 10 to 15% of a population, the math brings us right back to that figure of roughly 100 to 130,000 warriors. To field an army of the millions claimed by Western historians, the Mongols would have needed a total population larger than that of modern-day France, living in a desolate landscape that can barely support nomadic herding. The inflation of numbers served everyone's purpose except the truth. For the Mongols, it was a tool of terror. They wanted the world to think resistance was futile. They wanted the citizens of a besieged city to look at the dust cloud and believe that the end of the world had arrived. If a city surrendered without a fight, the Mongols saved precious manpower and resources. The lie of the million-man army was a calculated propaganda campaign designed to win wars before they were fought. For the Europeans, Muslims, and Chinese who lost to them, the inflation served as an excuse. It is shameful for a great civilization, with stone castles, steel armor, and centuries of military tradition, to be dismantled by a group of nomads who smell like wet dog and drink fermented mare's milk. It is humiliating to admit that you were outsmarted and outfought by a force half your size. But if you say you were defeated by the wrath of God, by a swarm of locusts so vast that they blocked out the sun, then your defeat is not a failure of martial skill, it is a tragedy of fate. It preserves your honor. However, recognizing the smaller size of the Mongol army does not diminish their achievement. On the contrary, it elevates it. It shifts the narrative from a story of brute force to a story of supreme intellect. It transforms Genghis Khan from a barbarian warlord into a military savant. It implies that the Mongol conquests were not an accident of history or a biological eruption, but a masterpiece of operational art. Consider the logistics of the Yam, the courier system. Because their numbers were few and their empire vast, communication was the lifeblood of the Khan. They established a relay system of stations every 20 to 30 miles across the entire empire. A rider could cover hundreds of miles in a few days, changing horses at every station. This allowed the Khans to coordinate the movements of their scarce troops across thousands of miles of terrain. They could concentrate forces rapidly at a decisive point, strike, and then disperse before the enemy could react. They treated the Eurasian continent like a chessboard, moving pieces with a speed that baffled their sedentary